20 years have gone by since Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. That's what we saw last week. And things have changed radically in those 20 years for all involved. Joseph was indeed sold into slavery to a man named Potiphar, a captain of Pharaoh's guard. And all goes reasonably well for Joseph until Potiphar's wife takes a liking to him. And Joseph spurns her advances, and he is wrongly imprisoned, having been accused of being the one who actually started it, even though it was Potiphar's wife who did. And he seems destined to languish at his majesty's pleasure, but his ability to interpret dreams, which until now has only got him into serious trouble, brings him before Pharaoh. And Joseph interprets Pharaoh's troubling dreams when no one else can. And so Joseph is appointed Prime Minister of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh the king himself. Now, Pharaoh's dreams, and some of you might recall this, speak of 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of drought and famine. And the 7 years of plenty, as we come to today's story, have come and gone. Egypt's barns are filled to overflowing thanks to Joseph's stewardship. But now the drought is biting. Famine is everywhere, and not just in Egypt. Canaan too is experiencing the effects of this famine. And Jacob's family, that's Dad and the 11 boys, are doing it tough. Joseph, at this point, is nothing but a distant memory. And it's the famine that preoccupies Jacob and his family. The threat of financial ruin, even starvation, is very real for them. But through the grapevine, Jacob somehow hears that there's grain to be found in Egypt. And so he decides to send the 10 older sons, the same 10 who had sold Joseph off into slavery. He sends them off to go and get grain from Egypt. And they arrive in Egypt and are ushered into Joseph's presence. And Joseph recognizes them immediately. But the brothers have no idea that this person of power is their brother. And so Joseph, and this is not the part of the story you get, but Joseph toys with them, as men of power have the capacity to do. And he puts them in a position where they are totally beholden to him. And the first piece of mischief, if you like, that he sort of inflicts upon his brothers is to ask them to bring Benjamin back to prove that they are not spies. Now, the brothers know that Jacob won't allow that. Jacob couldn't bear to lose Benjamin as well as Joseph. But such is the family's desperation that once the grain is gone, they have to return to Egypt to get more. But they can only return to Egypt if they have Benjamin in tow. And so Jacob reluctantly sort of gives in, and Benjamin goes with his 10 other brothers. When they get back, Joseph's next ploy is, having given the brothers a second lot of grain, he places a royal cup in Benjamin's sack. And no sooner are the brothers on State Highway 1 heading back to Canaan than Joseph has his police pull them over to the side of the road to check if the cup is in the sacks. The brothers, of course, have got no idea that this has been done to them. And as they search, they find the cup. And so the 11 brothers are hauled back to Joseph, accused of abusing his hospitality. And so Joseph says to them that they can return home, that's the 10 older brothers, but Benjamin, the unknowing thief, will become Joseph's slave. Now, maybe there's a bit of a test going on here to see if they'll sell Rachel's other son as they did him. A test to see if those 10 older brothers have changed at all. And maybe to Joseph's great sort of surprise and delight, Judah, who was responsible, or he was the one who came up with the idea of selling Joseph into slavery, he stands up and offers to take Benjamin's place, because he knows that the loss of Benjamin will kill Jacob. And that's where our reading, or our story, if you like, begins today. Judah exhibiting qualities he never sort of exercised towards Joseph. And Joseph finally overcome not only by the presence but the reformation of his brothers. And he has the great hall cleared. Imagine a place like this. A great hall cleared of everyone but himself and the 11 brothers. And then he speaks 3 simple words. I am Joseph. And what unfolds is drama, uncertainty, fear, and genuine surprise. It's a stunning revelation. 3 simple words, I am Joseph. And as the scripture says, but his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they by his presence. You see, there are the brothers in this great hall, standing before the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. And what's he told them? That I am Joseph who you sold off. And for the brothers, suddenly all the past comes flooding back. Like most of us, I think they know that revenge is a dish best served cold. And Joseph is no longer a scrawny 17-year-old upstart. He has the prestige, privilege, and most importantly, the full power of Pharaoh's kingdom, if you like, at his disposal. And he can do with these 11 men whatever he pleases. You see, I think dismayed is such a good word for what sort of unfolds when Joseph reveals himself. Not in their wildest dreams could they envisage that this man was their brother. They had convinced themselves many years ago that he was dead. And Joseph can see their fear, their anxiety, the sheer horror of what is potentially unfolding before them. And so he says, come closer to me. I'm not sure if they stepped forward that willingly. You know, a bit like this congregation when I say, come to the front a bit more. But they inch closer because, you know, who dares disobey the man who has your life in your hands? And he says again, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. You see, Joseph makes sure that there is no escaping their past actions. And if that is all that Joseph is going to say to them, well, the brothers' worst fears would have been realized in a matter of minutes. But Joseph, well, he speaks forgiveness and grace. While revenge may well be a dish best served cold, those of us who gather in a place like this, even if we don't always exercise it as fully as we should, we know that reconciliation is always better than revenge, even if it seems harder. You see, the power of reconciliation is not that it turns things upside down, but that we are turned right side up. And so it is for Joseph and his brothers. But there's more to Joseph's proclamation. Joseph goes to great lengths to say that somehow in all this mayhem, chaos and wrongdoing, God was working. Joseph says to his brothers, whether you realize it or not, I am the channel of God's salvation. And Jacob keeps emphasizing that. He keeps emphasizing that God's work has been, or that God's been working in all that has unfolded. God sent me, says Joseph, before you to preserve life. God sent me before you to preserve your family. Go and tell Dad that God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Simply put, Joseph tells his incredulous brothers that the famine won't kill old Jacob or them or God's promise, because God has seen to it. Not that anyone else in the story has seen that except maybe Joseph, and he learned it the hard way. Who could imagine an upstart 17-year-old, the Prime Minister of the most powerful nation on all the earth? Who could imagine a foreigner sold into slavery, commanding the government and people of Pharaoh? I don't know about you, but it beggars belief. Who could imagine that God would work in and through and underneath an upstart, egotistical 17-year-old? No criticism of any 17-year-olds here this morning. Is it any wonder the brothers are stunned that this is Joseph, a brother long presumed dead, that this brother could be the Prime Minister of Egypt? But I suspect what stuns them the most is that even in spite of all their deceitful dealings, God was at work. It's a sort of rags to riches story, for sure. But it's much more a story of God's grace and provision, even out of the most unlikely circumstances. At the heart of the story is salvation. And yet, while it seems a strange way to go about it, to take an upstart 17-year-old and sell him into slavery and have him live in prison for a while and what have you, this seems to be God's way of doing things. Because you see, when we turn to the New Testament, we find that God does something equally astounding. It's the reverse of Joseph's story in many ways. It's not a rags to riches story. It's sort of a riches to rags story. And yet it's the greatest salvation story we know. You see, one day an itinerant carpenter from a small town in an out-of-the-way part of the Roman Empire turns up and says, "I am Jesus." Or as John's Gospel so boldly proclaims, "I am God who humbles himself." Can you imagine God doing his saving grace thing in this way? And yet those wise enough, open enough to the Spirit, can see in this Jesus God's saving grace for the whole world. I don't know about you, but I find that the purposes of God are hard to pick even at the best of times. But they always have to do with salvation, with life. They always appear upside down to what we expect. You see, we've spent some weeks now on the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Who could imagine that the God of the universe would choose a family like Abraham's? It is a seriously dysfunctional group of people. But it's worth saying that even though they are seriously dysfunctional, they have one abiding quality. They have faith that God does what he promises. Even if they get in the way on occasions, like the 10 brothers, even if it doesn't always seem so obvious. And maybe that has something to do with Jesus and with us. You see, when we look at the Gospels, who could seriously believe that of all the people in Judea, Jesus chose those 12 men to be his disciples? They don't seem overly qualified for the position. They have a sort of a diverse and differing worldview. In other words, they're probably fighting with each other all the time. They are not the ones that the people themselves would have chosen. And yet after the death and resurrection of Jesus, what do we see? We see God working in them, through them, underneath and beyond them, but always with them. God working out his salvation for the world in the most unlikely people and circumstances. And the people in distant countries far from Jerusalem hear, I am Peter, I am John, I am Paul, I am Mary. But what they encounter is the Christ who lives in them. God working out his saving grace. And if we stop for a moment, isn't this our story too? Doesn't it seem utterly incredible that God brings his saving grace, his message of life and love and hope in us, through us, and beyond us? I am Scott, but you can put your own name in there. And people may look at us as Joseph's brothers looked at him, hardly believing their eyes. Because people who know me, they look at me and think, really? Could any good come out of that man? Can any good come from Nazareth? Could any of the goodness of God come from a group of people like us? And yet somehow, in the grace and mercy of God, who works even when we can't see what's happening, God comes to people just as he came to Joseph's brothers, the 12 disciples, yes, even us. You see, I don't think it's the way that we expect God to work. It's not really how the world expects God to work. But if Joseph and Jesus are anything to go by, it's the only way that God works his saving grace. It is the almost incredible and unbelievable good news of the gospel, that somehow the God who is working in the midst and underneath and beyond all things is doing it through the most unlikely people and circumstances. Not just Joseph, who makes it into the Bible, not just Jesus, who is the Son of God, but you and me. And we go out from this place not thinking, well, I'll face another week and I'll be back at church next Sunday, hopefully. We go out from this place because I am Scott and you are who you are. And somehow what God says to us as we gather is that through his grace, we are his channels of salvation for the world. That somehow in us and through us and underneath us and beyond us, God has come, that God is working. And the world is surprised to find that grace for themselves. It is one of the great blessings of the Christian life. Never underestimate it. Always believe in it. Trust, as the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did, that God always keeps his promises, even when he does it through the likes of us. Praise be to God for such a gift. Amen.